I'm just going to briefly introduce Mr. Chiu again, who is going to be speaking to us about the history of Watson's, the major pharmacy in Hong Kong. And I think one of the great things about this book, which has just come out, the perspective that it offers is that Mr. Chiu himself has spent many years within the pharmaceutical industry himself, working for Molnlycke Health Care both here and around East Asia, as well as for BD at sort of high-level administrative and executive roles, and also has a personal familiarity with the president and CEO of Watson's, with whom he's done many personal interviews, over 100 hours of interviews. Mr. Chiu has also been writing a history of pharmacy in Hong Kong itself, in pharmacy pharmacology, over the last 200 years, which is being published in serial form in the journal Pharmaceutical Historian. So he's quite experienced in writing about this period and this region. So I'm really excited to hear more about what's in store for us in the book. So I'll hand over to Patrick.
Thank you, Dr. Michael Stanley Baker, for inviting me here to share my research work on A.S. Watson, or otherwise known as Watson, to everyone. So I believe Watson's is not a new name in Singapore, because it has existed, or at least this product has existed in Singapore for over at least 100 years, which I will share with you later on. So in order not to hold up with everyone, because we've been delayed, so I will go right into it. Right. So the slides that you are seeing, I have some terminology which people have used in the 19th century, or so-called 19th century English or colonial English. Some of the words that these are the so-called anglicized words. Canton, in fact, this can be referred to as Guangdong province or Guangzhou. But the British, when they went to China, in the 19th century, I wouldn't say they were confused, but they just used the name to imply both. For example, there's a trend of nationalism since the 1950s. For example, more recently, in India, you come across with words like Kolkata. In the past, you used to be called Calcutta. So there are many nationalistic words coming into it. And then there's some words like the Old English, chemist and druggist. So what the hell is this chemist, druggist, chemist and druggist? But in fact, these are modern day pharmacy. In the English language, it's very interesting that when you say chemist, druggist, you can refer to a modern day pharmacy, or you can also refer to a pharmacist. So one word has good similar meaning, but it's a noun, but this noun has several meanings. So it's people that they are in the industry, they probably know. If not, people will be really confused with that. And also a word called coolie, which is not a very nice word by 23 standard, but in the 19th century, or even in the 1950s, 60s, coolie is a word that they refer to nowadays, what they call laborers, heavy lifting, manual workers. In the 19th century, they work along the pier to lift, the cargo. They don't have the cranes to lift it, and so people they have to use their brain how to move it. Dispensary is another interesting word, because dispensary clinic in many cases are the same, because I stay in Bencoolen in the hotel, so I walk across the street, and there's a word called Yaofang chemist, dispensary. So I went into it. In fact, it was a clinic. And then there's a clinic, it's a dispensary. So it's all very confusing. But because of history and because of heritage, people that have been keeping using on these words, which by now it has no meaning at all, if you really look into it. Anyway, one word which is not very much used in Asia or in the continent, it's called laudanum. So what is laudanum? Laudanum is actually a mixture. A mixture in the 19th century. These are all alcohol content liquid that they dissolve the active principles. For example, in opium, they extract morphine from the opium, which dissolve in the liquid. But of course, as time goes by, Laudano has also changed its definition from liquid to become a powder. You can also have a powder, especially when morphine was extracted in the early 19th century, and then it became commercialized by a company called Merck in Germany, and they mass produced it. So Merck at one time was the largest pharmaceutical industry because they're making so much money by selling morphine to all the drugstores. And in fact, in the 19th century, there was little no control of selling of narcotic drugs, whether it's morphine or heroin, which I will go into that. But of course, in Asia, it's very sensitive when we talk about opium, about opium addiction. But in Europe at the time, opium was not controlled until 1910 because of the discovery of heroin in 1897 by Bayer. So all these companies, they developed these drugs and they were selling, making millions of dollars. And opium farmer, very interesting work. In fact, the opium farmer were used by the British in Hong Kong, and these are not really farmers. The farmers are actually in India, in Bengal. They were cultivating the opium poppies, so the resins from opium in black color, they shipped to Hong Kong, and the government chemist, the farmer's job was to prepare this opium and sell it to the opium farmers. And opium farmers, in fact, are license holders. They bid for the monopoly to run for a few years. And Taipan is under the work, which when I started working in the IED, it was used, but now not anymore, Taipan, but which means expatriate chief executive or board chairman. Anyway, so let's start with Canton Dispensary. Now it should be called Guangdong Dispensary. Right? So Watson's rich heritage could be traced back to the Guangdong Dispensary, established by Dr. James Brecker, a physician, a port surgeon from the US, and he was inspired by Dr. Thomas Coolidge. We see that, in this right-hand picture about the gentleman with white pants were touching the head of this Chinese lady. In fact, he was treating this lady with eye disease. And Thomas Coolidge, he was a ship surgeon with the British East India Company. And then, he was doing on his free time to provide treatment to some of the poor people in China that they were not able to receive medical treatment because they cannot afford to pay for the TCM treatment. I think I should be giving it now. Okay, very good. So he was treating that, and then so many of these port surgeons hired by either the British East India Company or some of these trading companies from Europe or from the US, they live 6 months a year in Guangdong, normally from the month of July till January the next year. And then they spend another 6 months living in Macau, because by Qing Dynasty law, Guailos, expatriates, they are not allowed to live permanently on Chinese soil. So the Portuguese were very smart in the 16th century. They say that, we want to lease this piece of land, and then they lease it, and then they bring the family, their children, the generation they live there. So it becomes their permanent. Originally it was leased for temporary, accommodation, but they make it their homes. And now, yeah. So the 6 months in Macau, why from July to January they stay in Guangdong is because of the monsoon and also the typhoon. So from July to January in the South Seas and also up to the Japan Sea, there was the tropical cyclone coming, heavy rain. So in the 19th century, the sailing boats carrying cargoes, they would not be able to really go through this typhoon. Not like today, you have 100,000 ton, cargo ship or petroleum ship that you can really sail safely, but at the time it's not, it's dangerous. But British East Indian Company was a very interesting company that it was not a in today's term is a lot supposed to be a shipping company, a logistic, but in fact it was not. It was actually a representative of the British Crown. They also have their army to go into India to control India and administer India for 150 years on behalf of the British government. So, but because of the trade with China, was East Indian Company, the British Indian Company, they do not carry, they carry more, they carry the cargo, but they don't own the cargo. The cargoes are owned by, for the trips to China, the cargoes are owned by individual investors. So some of those ship surgeons, they have an allowance maybe for 10 containers, 10 cartons of opium or tea that they can bring and they can sell by themselves. So, but because British Indian Company was very conservative, so they do not encourage the shipment of opium cargoes into China because they think that this would jeopardize their shipping lines. So therefore, some of these free traders, some of the ship traders, they were not happy. One of them was called Matheson, Jardine Matheson cargo, and then he was making money, so he quit his job as a ship surgeon, and then he started in real time as an opium trader.
How many would it be?
Okay, so let's look at a little bit of tea, and then opium. The tea was the major commodity China exported to UK in the 17th to 19th centuries. In return, the UK export opium from British India to China to balance trade. So by 1830, China export 14,000 tons of tea to the UK and import 2,600 tons of opium from British India. Sounds like, it's small quantity, but in fact, the import value of opium was 10 times higher than the tea export from China. So the opium value was much higher. So these are so-called the official numbers of export to China. But in fact, 20 to 40% opium export to China was smuggled into it. So it was not recorded. And China was making a lot of money by having Mexican silver, which they prefer, that they got it from the British. But the British were very smart, very quickly they reversed the imbalance of trade. So it was actually by 1820 that the trade imbalance occurred. More opium going to, right? Yeah. So so the British first start trade with China in the 1730s, and 200 years later, the Central British fleet, they passed through a place called Fumen, Bogu, and the Portuguese name is called Boca de Garas. And then China was losing so much silver to the British traders. And then a governor called Lin Zishui, he was the governor of Guangdong and Guangxi provinces. He confiscated and burned the illegal import of opium by these free traders in Fumen, here, which is at the mouth of the Pearl River. This led the leading opium trader, William Jardine. The company name is called Jardine Matheson. Originally from Hong Kong, but now it's also very big in Singapore. They own the Gardens, the cold storage, and they are one of the biggest employers. So in Hong Kong, they employ about 150,000 people, but look, mostly, supermarket job, but it has impact because with the history. But if you go to visit them and talk about history, they don't like it because no one would like to talk about history, including Emer, Bay Area. They don't want to talk about they mass produce morphine or heroin, but it was their history. But so that because the British Indian Company, they would not allow these traders to ship a lot of opium to China because the Qing emperor didn't like it. So William Jardine, he lobbied the British government. He became an MP. He returned back to the UK to become an elected member of parliament, and he lobbied the British government to dispatch the Royal Navy to China, which started the first Opium War in 1939. Because the 60% of those confiscated opium belonged to him. So he lost a lot of money. So that's why, he asked the British Navy, the Royal Navy, to go to China to get it back, yeah. So there's a lot of, trade. So this is something that we really start war, trade imbalance. So China has a lot of experience in trade imbalance in the past, and now currently the same thing. So the first opium was supposed to start from 1939 until finish to 1942. But in fact, the war very quickly, settled. But the negotiation dragged on until 1842. So in 1841, Captain Charles Elliot, he was a chief superintendent of British trade. So, when the British India Company monopoly of trade with China was terminated in 1833, then the British Trade Commission, they established their office. It's a Trade Commission office. So it's really very advanced in their system. Now you have trade commissioners, here and there, but they started there. So there are two doctors, Alexander Anderson and Peter Young, who were successors of Dr. Brackett, who set up the first Canton dispensary. They followed the British to come to a place called Possession Point, which they have this so-called match sheds, at the time, to set up a dispensary. So they have patients. They're also selling some of the, medications over there. That place is there, but it's very crowded. It's overcrowded now. Yeah. So here is the treaty, the first treaty of the Opium War, which is now being kept in the National Palace Museum, Taipei. Why there? Because when Chiang Kai-shek, he left China on an involuntary basis, he brought all these treasuries from the Beijing Palace Museum to Taipei. So the original version is kept in Taipei, not in Beijing. So when the Treaty of Nanking, very old English word, but now it's called Nanjing, correct? Yeah, was signed after the Opium War in 1842. The Hong Kong dispensary, even though it was started up in Possession Point, but it became officially open. So there was advertisement in Friend of China newspaper at the time. The Hong Kong dispensary, Anderson and Young. So other than Hong Kong was ceded to Great Britain in this treaty, 5 other ports, including Guangzhou, Canton, Fuzhou, Ningbo, Shanghai, and Xiamen, which is Amoy. They were open for trade and missionary activities to Great Britain. The treaty is in bilingual, 2 languages, but the contents are somewhat different. The Chinese has their version and the British has their own version. So in the English version, they say that the treaty ports would allow British traders and missionaries to set up their homes there, to trade, without restrictions. But in the Chinese version, they say that they were allowed to stay in designated areas upon approval by the local officials. So each one say their own thing. So the original version is still there. Okay. And then, so what happened to the Hong Kong dispensary? Somewhere along the line, you have dispensary is actually a clinic. So you have medical doctors who come and go. And then in 1956, Thomas Boswell Watson, he was practicing medicine in Macau. And then he moved to Hong Kong and he became the senior partner, which he bought the practice, he bought it. But soon afterwards, he fell ill. And his nephew, called Alexander Skirvin Watson, was asked by Thomas. Thomas talked to his brother called Alexander Scott Watson. He was living in a location called Silesia. Silesia at the time was under Prussia. Now it's in Poland because the border, is shift, right? So Alexander Scott Watson and Thomas Watson, they were Scottish by nationalities. So Alexander Scott, he was a engineer. So when he was young, he went to Silesia. He worked for the Bank of Poland. But the Bank of Poland, they invest in Prussia, mining, mining areas. So he was engineer. So Alexander Skirving was brought up in Prussia. So his father asked him to go to Hong Kong to take over the business from his uncle because he was falling ill. But Alexander wasn't, AS wasn't. He was not a medical man. He was not a doctor. So when he inherited the business from his uncle, it was a clinic. Also have some sales of drugs. He cannot manage it. So he changed the business into a so-called marine supplier. 1958, that was at the time when the second opium war happened. So again, the British won, so, and by then, the opium importing to China becomes legal because the Qing dynasty lost the war with the British. So before it was illegal, but now it becomes legal. So a lot of opium going to China. And with a lot of ships. And with a lot of ships, there's a lot of supplies that you need to refuel. For example, you need to provide with them with fresh water, and then drugs and other things. And more importantly, by then, in 1950, 1960, Hong Kong becomes an entrepot, not only for opium, but also for the so-called bonded laborers. So a lot of, in Canada, it's called Juzai. These are laborers in the southern province of China that they sign contracts to work in the mines and plantations in Southeast Asia. At the same time, they were shipped to America, South America, and North America to become laborers in the gold mines, miners. But they don't have the gold, right? And when the gold rush died down, they become the railway workers, not to drive the railway engines, but to lay the tracks all the way from San Francisco to New York. So there was a long trip, So these were the laborers, okay. But I will come back to this, later on. So he was quite smart. So he turned the business into marine supply because a lot of ships coming and going, carrying human cargo as well as opium cargo into China, tea, So he was starting to make some money. But by 1860, he changed the name of Hong Kong dispensary into A.S. Watson and Co. So this is it. Yeah. So A.S. Watson was the guy. And then back in 1856, a doctor called Dr. Llewellyn was appointed as a manager and partner of the Shanghai branch of the Hong Kong dispensary. So this guy, he was in Hong Kong. He was because Watson wanted to do some business in Shanghai because Shanghai was becoming more vibrant. So he went there, he set up the business, and then by 1860, because A.S. Watson, he wanted to trade as Watson's, Llewellyn felt that no one knows about this thing. So he was quite smart. He sold his share in the joint venture business with A.S. Watson to a British guy called Kirby, E.C. Kirby. And this guy, once he got a business, he changed the name altogether. He used Llewellyn and Company. And then they turned the shop into a different one. So Watson's had no choice, but they had to set up another company with a guy called S.W. Clee to continue his business in Shanghai. So this is the picture. Watson, Clee and Company, pharmaceutical chemist. And that's 1860. In fact, who talked with it, they were a couple of decades earlier. So these are the pictures there. But of course, again, ill health, A.S. Watson returned to the UK in 1865 and passed away the next year. It's very interesting. And a lot of British Americans, they went to Asia, they lived there, and many of them, they become ill very quickly. So they have to return back. Malaria, a lot of, local diseases. Yeah. And then the guy continued with the business. This guy is called John Humphreys. He really turned the business around and become the largest business in the 19th century in Hong Kong. So who is John Humphreys? When he was a teenager, he set sail from London to Calcutta, now previously called Calcutta, India, in the mid-1850s. That was the Victorian time. And after working in Calcutta, in learning some commercial skills, Humphreys married another British lady called Jessie in 1886. They joined the gold rush in Australia soon afterwards because they want to become millionaires. A lot of British expatriates at the time, when they went abroad, it's something they want to develop. A couple of years later, they didn't have much luck, so they found that maybe they should move to another place, right? So after having been India, and also Australia, the only choice is either Singapore, Hong Kong. But because the opium trade in Hong Kong was so vibrant, so there are a lot of money to be made, so they went to Hong Kong, which was proven to be a very, very good decision. So Humphreys joined A.S. Watson and Co. as a bookkeeper. So he was managing all the books. I mean, like Chiu, managing books. So he found that, wow, there's so much money to make. So he very quickly he bought out the owners, right? Because he found that the growth would be tremendous with all these chips coming in and out. So he grew the business and it became a good taxpayer. And then the Hong Kong dispensary was recognized by the government because as a good taxpayer, we need to recognize your contribution. So all the dispensary, managed by A.S. Watson, become the appointed chemist to the Duke of Edinburgh and the governor of Hong Kong in 1869. With this title, then the brand of A.S. Watson become very well recognized. Right. So very quickly, what he did, when John Humphreys he married Jessie, after 2 years in Australia, went to Hong Kong. So his son, the eldest son, Humphreys, was born in Hong Kong in 1867. And he was groomed to take over the business. So when he was a teenager, he was sent to study boarding school in Southsea, which is near Portsmouth in the UK. And he was sent to become to be trained as a pharmacist. It's called pharmaceutical chemist, which is different from chemists and druggists, because in the UK they have this senior, someone who is more senior with a senior diploma, more qualified, then you're called a pharmaceutical chemist. Someone who has some basic knowledge, when you pass the entrance examination, then you're called a chemist. So they have this distinction that pharmaceutical chemists are supposed to be, more senior, and most of them, they are owners of pharmacies. So Henry Humphreys, you see, Henry Humphreys was the eldest son, and he married Alice and 3 children, and then Alice went back to the UK on the boat. She died, and then he has a second wife called Eva. They have one son, and he has a son called John David. John David died before Humphreys. He died in 1940. He was single and no children, so therefore, eventually, the business was not succeeded by anyone, so it was sold. So Henry Humphreys, he graduated in 1888 as a pharmaceutical chemist in the UK. So on the address, he put down care of A.S. Watson and Company Limited, Hong Kong. Yeah. So okay. So what happened to Henry? So Humphrey, he studied very hard. He learned all the skills, of making medicines, and then he returned to Hong Kong in 1889. At the age of 22, because it's a family business, he immediately become the manager. But what he did well was that when he was in the UK, he learned about all these trademarks. You need to register. Yeah. So he went back to Hong Kong. He registered the trademark. There was a previous trademark of Watson's. He registered the company logo as a trademark, and also they were selling a lot of products, 70, 80 products, and he also registered each of the product under the Watson brand. And this trademark, you say that because it's fusion. in 19th century, a dragon, a unicorn, and then a pagoda. So this was so so they have the formulations that they develop, is more based on the British pharmacopoeia, which they have this formulation. So they use that, but they use their own brand. So they were not the company that they developed the product, but they have developed their own brand, which I will talk a little bit later. And they import initially they import all these laudanum or opium cures, soda water, providing medicine. And then they also, when he went back, they were producing it already. But when he went back, he formalized all this trademark thing, and then the Watson brand become well known from Shanghai to Singapore by then. So laudanum. Let me talk a little bit about laudanum. Okay, what is it? In the second half of the 19th century, laudanum was imported as an all-purpose medicine, like some of these Chinese medicine. At the time, in Europe, in the US, a lot of these proprietary medicine, they are all purposes. So when you feel ill, sick, you have temperature, you feel cold, you can use it, you can take it. So laudanum, it contains opium, 10% powder opium or 1% morphine. It can help people with a headache, with a cough, with diarrhea. So a lot of things that even for babies, if they were crying, they feel sick, they can give it one spoonful of laudanum, and calm them down. So it's a wonderful medicine. But by so with China's opium smokers climbed to tens of millions by 1870, laudanum become abused as opium cures because it contains morphine. More importantly, was much cheaper than prepared opium sold by the opium farmers to opium dens in Hong Kong. But in China, it's a different story because in Hong Kong, it's a monopoly. So someone who has to bid for the license sell it. But in China, it's free import, so everyone can sell. Everyone can sell. In Hong Kong, people, they were not allowed to smoke opium at home because opium can only be smoked in the opium den. The opium dens, their license, that they pay this monopoly to operate. So people who smoke opium are the rich people, the so-called second generation rich people, they smoke and then they eat, But in China, all the opium dens, everyone can, if there's someone, they open. So not only the opium dens, a lot of shops, small shops, they were selling opium. So it becomes so rampant that, opium smokers, they're more opium smokers. The rich guys, they smoke original opium. Poor guys, the so-called coolies, what they do? They smoke secondhand opium. Today, when you talk about secondhand smoking, you refer to people who inhale the smoke with people who smoke cigarettes. But in the 19th century, secondhand opium smoking referred to firsthand is someone that who really have the opium pipe, they smoke opium. And then second opium is people that work in the opium shop, opium den, they scrape off the incomplete combusted opium in the pipe. They scrape it off. The work is called dross, D-R-O-S-S, dross. Dross is actually the ash of opium. After you smoke it, it becomes ash. But in fact, the ash still contains 50% opium. So these guys, they were selling off this to the coolies, they smoke it. Yeah. So this is how it's being made in China, First time, second time, very smart people, because workers in the opium dens, they have very limited salary, So what they do is that they sell it off initially, but when the owners, they know about it, they cannot sell it. You have to sell it to so the shops, the chemist shops, Western chemist shops in Shanghai, they find out that, and they start collecting this opium dross from the opium dens, and then they powder it, and then they resell it as opium cures. In what form? Not as smoking form. They make it into lozenges, pills, tablets, to become modern formulations. Okay, so opium cures start appearing in Hong Kong and China newspapers as early as 1870s. So these were import opium cures, laudanum. So Watson found out that they can produce it. So they set up a factory in Hong Kong in 1875. Humphrey was very smart, He bought the business from the previous owner, and then he built a plant in Hong Kong, in central Stanley Street. He was starting producing opium cures in lozenges and tablets, and then also soda water. Later on, we'll talk about it. And by early 1882, Watson established its own position as the #1 brand of opium cures throughout China, because it has pills, lozenges, and powders for opium cures. So while John the Baptist was the greatest opium trader, Humphreys was the biggest marketer of opium cures with a lot of profit. The profit will be 200 to 400% of profitability. So we come back to this picture. They have 78 products. In fact, a lot of them they're alcohols, spirit drinks. These are all supplied to the transiting ships, and also the expatriate population who drink a lot. Because drinking is not viewed as a dish in 19th century Britain or Europe. And they also produce about toiletries. They ship out Japan, they sell it. And then these are their own brand of opium. So out of 78 products, 10 are opium cures. 10 are opium. Not majority, but most profitable. So 80% of the profit come from this opium cure. Not from the wine, because the cost is very high. So this is what they do. And then the next wave was that in 1892, John Kerr, he was a medical missionary, also from the US. He was in charge of the Canton Hospital, which is called Colonial Hospital. At the time, they did not realize that, they thought that, if people they were hooked on opium, you give them morphine, this can replace opium. But they didn't realize that the opium, they didn't realize that morphine was equally, maybe even more effective than opium. They didn't know. Because at the time, you don't do clinical trials like today. And so he was selling it because, and this coolies, later they come, and they have these injections, Why injections? Because the hypodermic syringes came out around that time. It was mass produced. It was developed in the 1860s, but it was mass produced in the 1880s. So it was wide availability. So with morphine powder, hypodermic syringes, they were selling it, and it's much lower price, and also you have an instant feeling of euphoria. They feel good. So every morning there were long lines of opium smokers queuing outside Watson's retail drugstore. Every morning, because when you sell anything, if you sell it once, is it once, but they come every day, every day, more and more people, right? So starting in January, they were doing that, but very quickly, because in Hong Kong, opium tax revenue contribute anywhere between 15 to 50% of the colonial government's treasury. 50%, because Hong Kong's tax revenue derived from two main sources in the 19th century. Opium tax through this opium monopoly traded, and also selling of property, land. Even today, property-related tax contribute about 30% of Hong Kong's tax revenue. Right. So why people they complain? How come the Hong Kong property price do not come down? It will not come down because the civil service is funded by this tax revenue. Okay. So what happened was that Watson was selling this, and then they were making a lot of money, but the opium farmers they complained to the government saying that our business is being lost, and we cannot buy opium from you. And the colonial government said, wow, we don't have tax, all our civil servants, at least half of them, they will be laid off. They have to go back to England, right? So they immediately come up with a law, which is the number 13 law in Hong Kong in 1893, to stop the sale of morphine by chemists and druggists, by pharmacists, because it is hitting the pocket of the government. The civil servants have to go home or go back to Britain or go to India or whatever, or maybe come to Singapore. Right? So they stop it. So very quickly, I mean, it was the most effective, part of the government. And then coming back to Watson's, they not only sell opium kills, they also sell soda water. So there's a history back to the Canton dispensary in the 1832 that it was the first soda fountain installed. If any one of you know that, they put water into it. They took water. This is a water tank, and in Britain and also US, they have drugstores, pharmacies. They have this. So when patients were waiting for their prescription filled, at the time, they don't count tablets. They make mixtures, on, and you have to wait for half an hour before they can come up. So while waiting, you have a bowl of soda water. So they put water into the water tank, and then they put sodium bicarbonate into it, soda. So you have bubbles coming up. They put some sugar into it and then some color in it and drink. So this was something that they installed to partially finance the free clinic that they offered. So by 1866 in Hong Kong, Watson also started producing soda water, ginger beer and other flavored soda waters. So the Watson's brand becomes his iconic brand. It's called AS Watson brand. Initially in Hong Kong, then Shanghai and Manila. So the brand runs for a long history. Today, the Watson's brand of soda water is still being sold in Singapore, everywhere in Asia. It's a black color, logo. But what's interesting is that in 1827, the Watson becomes the bottle of Coca-Cola in Hong Kong and Shanghai. 1927. He enriched when Japan started the Second War with China from 1837 to 45. But what's interesting in Shanghai, because Chinese, they always want to become fashionable. They want to develop their own things. So they come out with the world's first chocolate soda. Have any one of you drink soda water with a chocolate flavor? But the Chinese, they invent one, So even though it tastes very lousy, but you're fashionable, shape, which you are, So this is something that they advertise, yeah. But of course, when the soda water bottling license with Coca-Cola was ended after the Second World War, Watson's, because they learned about how to make this, they invent their own cola flavor soda water. So it's called Cola. The Canada is called Cola. Cola is Cola, Cola, very interesting. Okay. So coming back, the other product that they have is the flour pagoda worm cakes. Okay. So Watson's was not the first company to produce all this. The first Santonin is a anti-wormer herbal drug to dispel the parasitic worms of young children because of hygiene, content. So young children, because of immunity low, they very easily they have worms in their intestine. So they have to get rid of it. So Santonin is extracted from a herbal drug, sourced from Siberia and also Turkmenistan in the 9th century. So the first company that produced Santonin worm cake is a company called Pfizer in the US. In 1850, they produced the first Santonin worm cake in the US, even though it was available in Europe. But it's very bitter taste. So what they do is the Pfizer cousins, there are two cousins. One is a chemist who makes medicine. The other one is a baker, but he makes desserts. So he turned this Santonin not as a tablet but as a chocolate flavor, bonbon, in French, the candy. So it was selling very well. So they got it imported in the UK, selling in Asia. So wasn't say that okay, we should also produce it, but the Chinese, in particular Canada, they don't like chocolate. Wow, it's funny though, because in the Chinese cuisine, Cantonese cooking, it's sweet and sour, right? How can something bitter, So they're not used to it. So it wasn't very smart. They turned it into a Chinese, Cantonese candy, with a pagoda shape, And the Canadians like it, they become the number one cake set, not only in China, but also Southeast Asia, the Chinese communities. So that product, worm cake, was sold until 1986, when this factory got burned down in Hong Kong, and then they stopped the production and they closed down the factory. Okay, the Philippines. Watsons went into it. Because they earn a lot of money through opium cures, a lot of profit, so they want to diversify their investment. And Philippines at the time in the late 19th century was booming, with Americans, with Germans, going there. So they built a plant. They called it the English dispensary in Manila. English dispensary. It's called perfumery. They sell perfume and pharmaceutical, perfumery, English dispensary. And then it sold very quickly. But because of intensive competition and also because instability in politics, so they accumulate a lot of losses, and then eventually they exit from the Philippine market in 1910. Okay, what happened to them in the 1900s? The opium cures was selling all over China, but then they were beginning to lose market share. Why? Because there are many Ningpo people. They work in Shanghai. They work, as assistant to dispensary. They were combining and mixing these opium cures in this Western dispensary owned by British American, pharmacists. And they were finding that every morning there are people lining up to buy this. They say, "Wow, there's so much money. I might as well own my own pharmacy shop and sell it." And because they know the formulation, they bribe people, because they don't know how it's made, but they know the proportion of it. They don't know what powder, because the British pharmacists will not allow them to know what is what. But they know where they're sourcing from, who delivered to them. So they go to these people and then bribe them and get the name of the drugs. So they open their own compound pharmacy, making their own opium cures, and they take market share away from Watsons and other Western pharmacies. So very quickly, the Chinese owned chemist shops, they were selling more opium cures. Not good quality, because good quality you have to produce according to the British pharmaceutical. The Chinese, they cut costs, they put some flour powder into it, they sell maybe 20% less, but 50% less quality stuff. So how they make money? So real quickly they take over. So what did Watsons do? By 1900s, they have the largest chain of drugstores in China because of the opium cures, but they were losing market share. So by then they were starting to acquire other British dispensaries in Shanghai to continue their growth. And then back in 1900, Box's movement instant. Right now we have to use correct wording, because Western historians, at one time they used the word called Box's rebellion, right? Rebellion. But in the Chinese history, they were not rebelling nobody, right? They were being manipulated by Empress Cixi. They were being manipulated. Many of them, these are Manchurian guys from the Beijing area, from Tianjin area, because my origin is Manchurian. So I can trace my roots back to Tianjin. My grandmother, she come from this boxer faction. His brother, Wang Wu, was one of the rebelling leaders of the boxers. So in our family history, we know these stories. Yeah. So in China, Communist China, today is called Boxers Instant. So it's not rebellion. Okay, it's actually an uprising, against the tyrants. So they soon swept over Beijing and North China, and Watsons at the Peking branch, Beijing branch, it was destroyed in the summer of 1900. So this is history, and this was documented in the U.S. Marines report. So the U.S. Marine Guards, they were in Tianjin. Because of the Boxers issues, a lot of burning, looting things. They were burning down the churches, So the Marines were sent in. So this was a report. You can look into this web link. On 16 June 1900, Boxers burned down Watson's drugstore in the southern part of the city, setting off a chemical explosion that tore through the richest part of Beijing. So they were very active in Chinatown. But after this Boxer incident, Watson exited Beijing and they moved to Shanghai and do their business there. So, but they went through a string of bad luck in the early 1910s. Or Watson's business took a downturn towards the end of 1909. Why? The Yangtze River flood occurred in 1909. The collapse of the rubber commodities market in Shanghai in 1910. The commodities market, rubber commodities, basically refer to the rubber plantations, futures, in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in Thailand. But around that time, Shanghai was the only place that they had the stock market to trade this, not Singapore, not Hong Kong. And then the Manchurian plague in 1910 to 11. So in these 3 years, the economy was bad. Thousands of people, they were laying off. So business was bad. But even worse was that the last straw was the Republican Revolution in Wuhan in October 1911, and all these events cumulatively led to a 50% depreciation of Chinese silver currency. So Watson's was extending a lot of credit by providing stock, consignment stock, you sell it. So by the time, they put out a lot of stock, but with the drop in currency, what they get back is 50% of what they sell. So they could not continue it. So they were really badly hit. But they survived. They survived. Which I will tell you why. And then, during the First World War I, they also suffered because the wars between the UK, Germany, and morphine and heroin, which were produced in Germany, would not be able to ship out, produced by email and also by Bayer. They could not ship out because the British blocked it, and even worse, sugar was regarded as a strategic commodity by the British. So they would not be able to ship out to the colonies because it's not home market. So Watson was hit very hard by the narcotic raw material shortage and also the sugar for the soda water. And then you come again, in 1922, the communists and the nationalists, they have this riots in Hong Kong and then later on in Guangzhou because the British were not paying the workers the minimum wages, even though the law in Hong Kong said it was minimum wage. But the British companies, including Watson, they were paying lower than the minimum wage. So people, they went on strike. So they were surprised. But eventually, the British settled down with the Kuomintang, and then they withdraw this riot labor. And then in 1923, there was a dangerous drug ordinance. They forbid them to sell opium pills anymore in Hong Kong. But of course, you cannot sell in Hong Kong, but the British do not stop them exporting. Do not stop them export. So they continue to export these opium cures to Southeast Asia and Taiwan, to hundred thousands of Chinese laborers. Yeah. So there's some record that I can show it to you. But of course, in 1929-37, Henry Humphreys, that was his last shareholder report. He mentioned it, that in regards to this company's business, this will be more readily understood when the fact is appreciated that on account of the lack of business during the past year or so, that he was referring to the Great Depression, that over a few years, the business was low. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese who had for years been a source of considerable revenue and profit to the company have been expatriated from Indonesia, Strait Settlements, Federation of Malay States, and the Dutch Indies. So hundreds of thousands of Chinese laborers working in Southeast Asia, they were taking opium cures. So they could not sell in China because of competition. The Chinese chemists, they were taking market share away. But In Hong Kong, they cannot sell, but they sell into Southeast Asia. But with the Great Depression, the commodity prices of rubber and tin went down so low, so they were not able to continue. So, and this is something that they suffered tremendously. And then the Japanese occupation, 3 years and 8 months, they suffer very badly. And then they soon emerged from the Japanese occupation in 1945, because they hide all this soda water equipment, and all that stuff, and sugar covered. But in the early 1950s to 1963, their business, jumped up, basically because of the Korean War. The Korean War in Asia, Coca-Cola has a bottler in Hong Kong. They stopped Watson's, and they have someone who produced for them. So Coca-Cola was shipped to Korea for the U.S. Marines, U.S. Army. But Watson's produced their own cola soft drink. So who drank them? The airline, the United Nations forces. The American GI soldiers, they drink Coca-Cola. The other guys, they drink the Watson drink because it was cheaper. Because a lot of people the Korean army soldiers, they drink the cola because in Watson's cola, because they don't have any soda water plant in South Korea. So in the 50s and 60s, they start acquiring business. So in 1973, acquired Park and Shop supermarket, and then Finland Ice Cream in 1973. And then the turning point was change of hands from British to Chinese entrepreneur. A gentleman called Li Ka-shing, what happened was that A.S. Watson in 1963 was the majority shareholder, the Humphreys family, because they don't have anyone who inherited. So they sold it to J.D. Hutchinson, Hutchinson International Limited. So in 1973, with the oil crisis, HIL, they would invest heavily in Indonesia. But because of the 1983 oil embargo, oil crisis, the commodity, the Western economy dropped tremendously, the pricing dropped. So they were almost bankrupt. But HSBC came in as the white knight. So they inject money into this, Hutchinson International, for them to merge with Whampoa Docks to become HWL. And then they very quickly listed in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in January 1978. Before there was an announcement coming out about the economy was not doing well. So Li Ka-shing, he had an eye on the Whampoa Docks Limited because they have a large land bank in Hong Kong. But the British guys were not talking to him because the British at the time, they feel Chinese guy, we do our business, you do business. So even though you're interested, you talk about, we don't want to talk to you. But because HSBC, they acquired 25% of the business. They financed them, so equivalent to about 25% of their equity. So when HSBC talked to Li Ka-shing, because HSBC was financing Li Ka-shing's property development in Hong Kong, separately with the expatriate West British guy. So Li Ka-shing say, oh yes, I'm interested in the 25%. So he bought from HSBC, so HSBC can exit, because as a bank, you're not investor, you lend money, but if your money you cannot recoup it, then you have to turn this debts into equity. So he sold it to Li Ka-shing. So Li Ka-shing decide, once he acquired 24%, he also acquired more stock from the stock market to become to have 31%. So he becomes the chairman. With 25%, he was not the chairman, so he acquired more quietly and become the chairman. So once he did that, Li Ka-shing is someone that he retained the good people, even though they're Western people, even though he didn't speak much English, but he used a translator. So he knows that, he can rely on these people, to turn the business around. And then So he hired a guy called Yin Wei to come to Hong Kong to grow the retail business. Basically, he wanted to turn that into a cash generator to finance the property development business, which he did very well. So, but at the same time, Yin Wei, he started to use the Watsons instead of just Watson as the brand, which was developed a century ago. And then they went into Taiwan market. This guy, Rodney Miles, who I also know him quite well, he was the former chairman of the Hong Kong Trade Club, but he worked in Hong Kong in the 1980s. So Yin Wei asked him to go to Taiwan. He looked at it and he report back. In 1987, Taiwan had 20 million or 4 times the Hong Kong population with a similar urban culture and shopping habit. Hong Kong working females who we had the confidence to replicate Hong Kong's success. Right. And then rapid growth in 1984 to 1997, despite all this, hot air about the Sino-British negotiations about the return of Hong Kong back to China. So Yin Wei and his team, they started off in 1981 in Hong Kong with 20 shops, retail shops. It's a mixed bunch. Supermarkets, drugstores, toy shops, restaurants, very fermented business. But Yin Wei coming from Asda supermarket and also work in the UK. So very quickly he focused in the supermarket and drugstore business. So from 1981 he turned 20 shops. By 1997 it becomes 700 shops in Shenzhen, in Taiwan, Singapore, Macau, Beijing, Guangzhou, Thailand, Malaysia. So he grew it very quickly. And then what happens in 1997? On the 2nd of July, 1977, Thailand was the first Asian country that was attacked by hedge fund managers. So business dropped. So the Asian currency, Thai baht, dropped 40%. Well, Indonesian, 83%, year on year. So the whole business collapsed. And then, because Hutchinson went forward even though Dikashi was the largest holder, but a lot of institutional investors, they told him that, maybe you should watch out, to balance your portfolio, not only invest in Asia, but with your expertise, with your experience manager, you should also look into outside of Asia. So which he did, And then what he did was that the first quantum leap was in the UK. So he asked Yin Wei to go to the UK, and then because of the Watson distilled water, the soda water, so they work in the water business. So they acquired a couple of mineral water companies, Crystal Spring and Breadboard Waters, and they built a brand called Powwow. So with these two brands, they have 70% of the home and water delivery market in the UK. And at the same time, in the year 2000, they acquired Savers, which is a 100-shop discount drugstore in North England. So that was the first one. Secondly, 2002 and 2006, within 4 or 5 years, they acquired 4,000 stores in Europe, with Quebec in the Netherlands, the Benelux country, Superdrug in the UK, Rossmann, 40% of Rossmann in Germany. Rossmann is the second largest drugstore in Germany. Marriott is the second largest in France for cosmetics, like Sephora. Yeah. So, and then in 2001, they have 125 shops in Europe. By 2006, they have 4,200. So this guy is someone, okay, Yin Wei. So in his 25 years at Watsons, what he learned from Humphreys was that he needed to build his own brand. So in his shops, about 40% of 60% of his products coming from global portfolios, like a lot of American brands and German brands, but 40% from his own label, including Watsons. Watsons is a brand, but many brands, they don't call Watsons, but they belong to Watsons. And they have 60 to 70% gross profit margin. And the global brands, they only have 30 to 40%. So because of this, Watsons was able to survive every crisis because they have so high profit margin that they cannot fail. In Europe, the biggest drugstore chain is called Boots in the UK. 27% of their product portfolio have their own product, high margin. Manning, Guardian is the lowest. Only 10% of the products coming from their own brand. The 90% are global brands. But global brands, they have low margin. In China, they were able to grow so fast because 50%, more than 50% of the product they sell in their drugstores are their own brands, with 60 to 7% gross margin. So this business cannot fail. So Yin Wei achieved 100 billion Hong Kong dollars revenue. He grew from 26%, 21 billion in 1997. By the time he left, it's 100 billion. So big jump. Okay, his successor, Dominic Lai, he took a different approach. He come from a financial background. He worked for Citibank, so he's very experienced. But more importantly, one of his employees at Citibank, is the wife of Li Ka-shing's eldest son, Victor Li. Even though it's a public company, you need to have relationships. Otherwise, you cannot grow so fast. So he treated Victor Li's wife very well when she was there. But when she got married, he didn't work for him anymore. But very quickly, he asked him to join Watson because his supervisor, his boss, he liked him. They liked her. So the husband also liked him. So he's still there, right? So Lai's leadership, he changed the whole organic growth in emerging market. But of course, the challenges was big, even though he has relationship, in his family. Global financial crisis, 2008, Eurozone crisis, Brexit, China-US decoupling, COVID-19, Russia-Ukraine war, so they have all this, but because of the high profit margin that they have, so Watson's business still very healthy. Okay. But of course, they also have global competition. They are number 3 in the world. Number 1 is CVS, 10 times bigger than them. Walgreens Boots Alliance is 5 times bigger than them. But their profit margin, the net profit margin, is about 1 to 2%, very low. But Watson has 6 to 7% net profit margin. Indirect competition from specialty stores, Holland and Barrett, and also Sephora. So they also take market share away from what they have. They have a customer connectivity strategy, looking at e-commerce as some of what they do. And then in 2014, Temasek acquired 25% equity holding of Watsons. They have an original plan to exit within 3 to 5 years, because normally investors, they don't invest for 400 years. So whenever they can, improve their shareholder value, they exit. But unfortunately, with Brexit, 2016, and then China US decoupling, so they were not able to exit. So the supermarket business all over the world, they're not making money. In Guangdong province, AS Watson, they have it. So in 2019, they merged the Pan Shop supermarket in Guangzhou, in Guangdong province, the so-called Greater Bay Area. They merged with Yonghui, which is owned by Tencent.com in China. So and Watson's ownership become direct 40%. And this is what Temasek owns, 24.95%, with population. So we are coming to the end of this book talk. Watson's, to me, is a Victorian legend which lives on and continues to grow. It can be summarized from his humble beginnings in 1841. So Watson's transformation from a colonial chemist to global health and beauty retailer is a journey full of twists and turns, but they were smart to have very high profit margin for their private label. Dr. Stuart Anderson, Imperial Pharmacy historian, views Watson's history as the history of pharmacy in Asia and the legacies of European colonialism. So historians, they always have this, they can trace back, to the British, the glory British imperial state in the 19th century. Indeed, next time when you visit Hong Kong, there are two streets in Hong Kong which named after who I described. Humphreys Avenue in Tsim Sha Tsui is a shopping area, which they own. So the two streets, the Humphreys Avenue and also the Watson Road that they have is quite interesting that you can visit there. And for those who are here, there are some books that if you're interested, you can buy. And then in my last slide, so this is the last one that for those who are online, that if you are interested, what I talk about, which is the part one of the book. The part two is more to do with the management. So for those who are coming from business background or business graduates, you'll be interested to look at the part two, which I have not talked about. There's a 30% discount if you buy online from World Scientific, which is the publisher of it. So thank you very much